This is Module 6, Video Response. My name is Burley Rutland. I'm in the School of Behavioral Sciences at Houston Christian University. This is for Counseling 6323, Crisis Response and Trauma Care for Dr. Lynn Hale. Presenting this on June 22nd, 2025. So 3 main questions we're going to go through for this discussion. We'll go through them one at a time. The first question after watching the video assignment for this week is, what are the needs and challenges of the heroic phase? So the video presented 3 different phases that we're going to go through and discuss. First, I want to relate those to the disaster phases in our textbook. So Miller 2012 identifies 7 stages of disaster. The heroic phase that we're going to talk about today, as described in the video, is primarily active in the rescue and remedy stages that Miller discusses. So according to Miller, the rescue phase involves a period when efforts are organized. So there's initial efforts that are set up to get people out of an initial disaster situation, and the remedy phase is active when relief efforts are present. So the heroic phase that the video for this week talked about is active in both that rescue and remedy phase that Miller discusses. The overall structure that we're going to discuss today that was presented in the video comes from a HCU online course development video that was initially presented on April 23rd, 2019. It's called The Needs and Challenges of Disaster. In that video, Jennifer Sisney, who is the team coordinator for the AACC National Crisis Response Team, the AACC being the American Association of Christian Counselors, she has a conversation with Michelle Louviere, who is the clinical director of Celebration Hope Center, which is a counseling center arm of a church that appears to be in the New Orleans, Louisiana area. So this conversation centers around Ms. Louviere's experience with disaster response, really interviewing her with Ms. Sisney acting as the interviewer. So the majority of the topics we're going to discuss today are directly related to what's stated in that video. So the heroic phase is the first stage that's discussed in the video. One of the things that tends to happen in the heroic phase is that people tend to deny the impact the disaster is having on their homes. So in the video, they discuss that this can be an effective coping mechanism. I tend to strongly disagree with that. And I think I've referenced a few times in other papers that I've written for this class that I did a couple of years of professional disaster relief work as a construction manager for a mid-sized nonprofit in the Houston area, and probably half dozen or more years as a volunteer outside of that doing disaster relief work. So I can say from that standpoint that people denying the impact that the disaster is having on their homes is really dangerous. I've seen that with a number of people. We had a gentleman in the tax day flood who, the houses all around him were destroyed. We were working on 12 houses up and down his street. Well, 11. Actually, he became the 12th eventually, but for several months, he insisted that nothing was wrong with his home. And he saw the work we were doing and watched us, staying in this community for months and taking houses from, mucking and gutting, ripping them out to completely restored, and had a number of conversations with his neighbors and began to develop a little bit of trust with us. Finally invited myself and one other gentleman into his home. And as soon as you open the door, you could just smell the mold and mildew. And they had a young special needs daughter. It was affected that the mold and mildew were affecting her. The living conditions in the home had deteriorated significantly in that time. And he was denying the impact the disaster had on his home and was putting his family in danger as a result. So in the video, they advanced this idea briefly that it can be a coping mechanism to deny the effects the disaster is having on your home. I would strongly agree with that. And I have numerous other examples of that being the case, that this is not an effective coping mechanism. It's actually maladaptive. That's just the one that came to mind. It's really my one of my earliest encounters with someone so adamant in denying that their home was damaged when it so clearly was. They also in the video suggest that people in this heroic phase tend to deny the impact of disasters having on them and their families. Again, same example that I'm drawing on in my past experience. That the gentleman in question, ultimately did recognize that the mold and mildew that was developing in the home was having an impact on his daughter's health. They had noticed an uptick in some of her health issues and resulting visits to hospitals and medication adjustment, which is part of what made him willing to then have us in his home, assess the damage, and begin to do some work. So same scenario, that this is not adaptive. It's not a helpful coping mechanism to deny the impact that the disaster is having either on yourself, your family, or your home. People also in the heroic phase will also utilize extraordinary measures to protect their homes and families. In my experience, this might lead to lying to agencies and trying to cheat the system. I encountered this quite a bit. Oftentimes it was someone asking me, when I worked as a professional in this field, it was someone asking me to include some pre-existing condition in their home as related to storm damage. That's a big no-no. You can get in a lot of trouble doing that because you're misallocating government or charitable funds to really improve a pre-existing condition in someone's home. So you can get in a lot of trouble doing that. The person's hopefully not directly thinking about that. They really are just thinking about helping their family. That they may be familiar enough with how this goes if their house has been hit by numerous disasters and trying to put one over on the person running a recovery program. But often this idea of going to extraordinary measures to protect their family leads to some dishonesty. I also had someone ask me once if they could just pay me directly out of pocket into my pocket to put them ahead of the line of houses we were currently working on. And of course, we didn't do that. But people do get desperate, and their goal is often to help their family, and they will often try to game the system, unfortunately. I think in the video they were talking more along the lines of people risking themselves in some type of sacrificial way to help themselves and their families. I've seen some of that. Those examples don't jump out in my mind as readily because I wasn't as put off by those things. I kind of expect that to see people really going above and beyond for their families. That's one of the beautiful things about doing disaster work is you get to witness people doing things that are maybe beyond what they thought their capabilities were, working long hours, driving long distances, sacrificing some of their supplies and goods, whether it's water and food and gasoline to run generators to sheetrock and insulation and things like that to rebuild a home. And that's a really beautiful element of seeing people being willing to sacrifice and go to extraordinary measures to protect themselves. But there is a little bit of a underbelly to that as well, where people are willing to do some dishonest things and try to play with the system a little bit and try to cheat it. People, according to the video, also try to stockpile community assets. I've definitely seen this. I've seen various versions of this. Where you'll go into a couple of homes and they have no water and don't know where to get water and don't know where their next meal is coming from, and then you go into one house on that block and there's enough water for 2 months and canned goods for at least that long, and they already have some sheetrock, they have gasoline stockpiled for a generator, and hoarding these community assets. I certainly understand that response. It makes sense. It seems like good prep to say, I don't know how long this recovery is going to last in my area. It could be 2 months, and I'm going to be prepared for that. But what that can tend to do is limit the resources that are available to others, which is the point that the video is making. And also in another article, Zhao et al. 2025 stated that resource misallocation degrades recovery performance concerning specific needs and requires pre-disaster planning and management of resources. The Zhao article is talking a lot about broader community-related resources and how communication and transportation is managed pre- and post-disaster. This also applies to recovery assets like water, like gasoline, like basic food needs, and a lot of the nonprofits that work on disaster recovery will also help manage some of these resources, and that can be really valuable for the people that haven't prepped as well. And also, if you can connect neighbors, maybe where there is one who has prepped really, really well, and when they recognize, hey, I'm not going to need 2 months of supplies, I'm going to need 2 weeks. Hopefully, they're willing to share. And I have seen some of that take place, and that's really cool to see when a community like that, where someone has prepped really well, and good for them for doing so, but then is willing to share some of those supplies with their neighbors who may not have prepped at all, and they're willing to help them out. So the next phase I talk about in the video is the honeymoon phase. This can include a crash point. We're going to describe the who, when, and why this may occur. So the first thing I want to do is identify how this fits in with Miller's model. In terms of Miller's from 2012's stages of disaster, the honeymoon phase can span the rescue, remedy, and recovery phases. So that the honeymoon phase could be potentially long-lasting. We've already covered what rescue and remedy looks like in the previous section. According to Miller, the recovery is the stage of disaster where some initial stability begins to occur. So in this phase, back to the video, can include great gratitude. And I definitely saw this. There's a lot of people, a lot of clients I worked with who were extremely grateful for what we're able to do in the honeymoon phase. And the honeymoon phase can be prolonged when a client sees that they are getting some help, and it can be extremely short when a person maybe has some help to clean their home out initially from whatever damage is done by the disaster, and then all the help evaporates. And the honeymoon phase, in my experience, can have two big peaks with a dip in between. So there may be a honeymoon phase on the initial rescue, where they're taken out of the situation. There may be a little bit of a hump on remedy, where there's some initial work done, maybe a tarp's thrown up on a roof, and that's done by one organization. There's another little peak. And if an organization like the one I worked for is going to come in and has some funds available to do some recovery work, there may be a big prolonged honeymoon phase while some real work is done on the home. But this can also be frustrating when there's 20 houses on a street, and 15 of them are hit pretty bad, and you get to work on 2 of them because those people are able to demonstrate a medical or financial need to receive those funds, and they qualify and others don't. So there may be a neighbor going through a long honeymoon phase on recovery, and there may be several neighbors that are watching that, and that actually adds to their frustration and stress because they see these people getting help and they are not. Oftentimes when you're working on one person or 2 people, 1 or 2 people on a street, the neighbors kind of know, hey, this person can't help themselves. They don't have the funds. They don't have the close family members, or maybe family members that are capable of doing some of this work for themselves. If that member's not, they don't have the resources, the assets, the funds to do this work themselves, and they're really grateful. And it's often like a community building activity when an organization is able to come along and do some recovery work. So this can build some gratitude. It can also build some resentment, and it's a good thing just to be aware of as a disaster recovery worker, that some neighbors may be really happy to see you there, and some may not. And if you park in front of their house, you may get your truck keyed or some stuff stolen out of the bed. And I've never had my truck keyed, but I have had some stuff taken, I think, by some neighbors who felt like maybe the resources that were in the vehicle to do recovery on a certain person's house, maybe they thought they needed it, and whatever. We can't win that battle every single time. But the great gratitude is a beautiful part when you get to experience that. There's also this idea that's presented in the video that in this honeymoon phase, people tend to believe that everything is going to be okay. And again, I think this can come in waves. And the video didn't necessarily talk about this. This is part of my experience working in disasters, is that there may be an everything is going to be okay part of rescue. When they are rescued or pulled out of that desire, there may be a little lull in that, like, man, I got rescued, but now I don't know how am I going to fix this house? What am I going to do? And then, some remedy, and maybe that spills into recovery comes along, and then they realize, hey, I've got $50,000 worth of damage, and this recovery organization is going to do, 20 of it. So what do I do about this other 30? So there may be a little, everything's going to be okay. They see some significant work being done, but their house is not back to normal at the end of it. And that can start wear out that honeymoon phase and get us to the next part we're going to talk about here shortly. So there's also a tendency to focus on the feel-good stories. Most of the clients I worked with were having some type of feel-good story because, we were there with government funds to do some significant work on their house. And so that kind of generated its own feel-good story. But again, for some people that didn't go quite as far as they want. There were some, frustrations in the process. And, I certainly did my best to be really transparent, help them understand that and walk them through there's things we can do, there's things we can't. So managing expectations can help a lot to not get this feel-good story to a place where it leads to some unmet expectations and some disappointment. There's also an idea in the honeymoon phase that normalcy is possible. Normalcy often takes a very long time, and helping clients understand that we're working towards a new normal, not back to your old normal, whatever that was, because there's probably been some permanent change. There might be a loss of a loved one, and I've dealt with that a couple of times where someone lost someone either in a flood or in a freeze, or not directly related to, but kind of indirectly related to these events going on, where emergency medical services were not available and not able to reach them, and there was some type of health crisis in the middle of this disaster. Some really tragic stories, and so for them, nothing is ever going to be the same, even if we're able to restore their house. Things are not going to be the same. People have often lost what they consider to be irreplaceable property. If they had pictures from the 70s, 80s, 90s when everything was not digitized, and we've lost albums and albums, and we lost grandma's wedding dress, or something like that, a car that was my granddad's and is now a total loss because of how it was flooded. There can be some really tough situations. Their jobs may be lost, or at the very least lost temporarily. There may be a gap in income there that's going to be really tough. So believing that normal is possible can be something to hang on to for a little bit, but it may not be reality and may lead to increased stress down the road. Stress on resources and damage to infrastructure also can lead to lengthy recovery, which delays any type of return to normalcy. Zhao et al. 2025 addresses this, and the reality is that prolonged periods of feeling like things are not going to be normal are incredibly stressful, and lead to some disillusionment after this honeymoon phase is over, which is the next phase. So for our third and final phase discussed in the video, the question is, or the statement is, during the disillusionment phase, fear, anger, and hopelessness can set in. What types of clinical conditions may develop from these circumstances, and what type of treatments best overcome them? So again, just tying this back into Miller, according to Miller's 2012 7 stages of disaster, disillusionment is primary active in the recovery phase. So we're going to see this disillusionment as things are trying to get back to normal. The honeymoon phase wears off. We realize not going to get quite as far as we hoped. So that being the case, what do I do now, right? Things are not going to go back to the same. So this can lead to feelings of hopelessness. Brooks et al. Addresses this. Compensation process can be arduous and unfair, creating stress for individuals and communities. Brooks examined the psychological component of disaster recovery process and discovered that agency and litigation-related disaster compensations that need a significant overhaul to reduce stress related to communication and process efficiency. So this process can be very protracted. It can drag out for a very long period of time. And that can lead to depression. It can lead to anxiety. It can lead to some post-traumatic stress, right? So disasters are often sources of significant trauma, and the trauma that exists there can drag out for a long period of time, exacerbating the initial stress and continuing to be active as some post-traumatic stress develops from that initial event. So this is incredibly difficult to deal with. Abandonment issues can also rise because outside help is shrinking. So you got rescued. There's some initial remedy. Maybe you got some help in recovery, but that's all going to go away. And now all these people that have been helping you have gone on to help others, and then eventually back to their own lives. And towards the end of a recovery phase, places where I worked, those funds run out. And so there's going to be people who qualified but don't get helped because they were just, further down the list. And there's X amount of dollars allocated, and they've been spent, hopefully not misspent, but responsibly spent on legitimate disaster damage. So everybody gets as much legitimate help as they can. But at some point, those funds run out, and those funds are almost never going to meet the need. People may also be fearful about their financial future. Many people that I met feared that they could not complete repairs beyond what we could do, that they didn't have the funds, they didn't have the ability, they didn't have the physical resources, the physical ability to do the remaining repairs that need to be completed on their house. Insurance wasn't going to pitch in. Maybe they didn't have insurance if it was flood related. This can also lead, just disillusionment can also lead to feelings of helplessness. The disasters likely highlighted, the individual's need for help and their own inability to help themselves. There's a higher occurrence of addiction, domestic violence, and general long-term effects may lead to these maladaptive coping strategies. So this was something that's noted in the video, that some particular acute effects can lead to new addictions, increased a frequency of addiction, recurrence of an addiction that was in recovery, as well as domestic violence, some type of anger issue related to depression, anxiety, stress. So I think these were the two biggest things that were noted in the video, and it was kind of identified as a maladaptive coping strategy. Anger is also a frequent response. Questions around why did this disaster happen to me? Why did it happen to my friends? Why did it happen to my family? Or why did it happen to me and not my neighbors? Why did it happen to my neighbor and not me? Is there some survivor's guilt? Anger around help that was either not coming or was taking too long, the quality of the help that did come, and ultimately, as we mentioned before, anger related to an inability to care for oneself. All this can lead to a sense of futility. Many people I encountered would say things along the lines, "I'm so glad you're here. I couldn't do this on my own." Like I was trying to work on this house, and oftentimes they'd done a little project here, there, and we're trying to do what they could to take care of themselves. It was just very obvious that this is not something that this person is going to be able to recover from on their own, and that can be incredibly difficult to deal with. This idea that I've got this major problem. I can't live in my home. This is not survivable long term, and I can't fix this myself. I just feel totally helpless, and every effort I'm putting into this is completely futile. So as far as recovery mechanisms, accepting and learning that I'm not capable of fixing this problem on myself by myself, and I'm going to need some help. So some basic CBT aligning cognitions and behaviors of, okay, I think I can do this myself. I recognize through my behavior and my own ability to try to work on this, recovering myself from this disaster, I can't do it, right? And so therefore, I'm going to have to ask for help. And it's okay to ask for help, right? That can be a very helpful thing for a person to realize, is that I'm not able to do this. The spiritual element is incredibly important as well. And the video, again, highlights this, that understanding that people are here to help because God has sent them, right? It's oftentimes Christians that are helping. There's non-Christians that help as well for faith-based reasons, and I've encountered numerous of those people working in tandem with them. But the large majority, especially in the South, in the Houston area, in the area that I live in and operate in, most of the volunteer recovery work is done by Christians. And that's a fantastic place to witness, to share the gospel, and to give people hope and faith in God, beyond what they just have in people and the government, which can generate a lot of distress when people aren't coming to help enough, and the government and different agencies are not fast enough in responding or don't bring enough resources to bear in their response. So helping to refocus people on the spiritual aspect of recovery, that God still loves them no matter what has happened. Their care they are receiving is from God and out of His love and His abundance. We're not just limited by our own resources. It's okay to ask for help. People will want to help us because they believe that God helps them, God loves them, and therefore they should love others as well. Can be very, very helpful. Adaptive coping mechanisms, rather than denying that this is happening and that it's as bad as it is, very helpful to understand that I do need help. I can't do this on my own. God still loves me. And to have an organization or agency or counselor that's helping them process these things in this way. Okay, that wraps it up. I'm going to cover my resources real quick. So in alphabetical order, I referenced Brooks et al. Title that from 2024. Title of that article was Psychosocial Impacts of Post-Disaster Compensation Process, Narrative Systematic Review. That was in the publication BMC Psychology, issue 12-1, page 539 through 18. Also referenced primarily the HCU online course development video from April 23rd, 2019. The video is titled Needs and Challenges of Disaster. That video is available on YouTube. Also referenced Miller G. 2012, Fundamentals of Crisis Counseling. That's our primary text for the current course. And then Zhao et al. Title from 2025, and the title of that article is Post-Disaster Recovery Planning for Infrastructure Systems Based on Residents' Needs, a Hyper-Network Approach. And that was published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, volume 118. Okay, thank you very much.